A rope was passed under his arms, and like a piece of baggage, he was again lowered into the hole. No one said a word. It was as if they were at an interment. The hole was deep and dark. The moonlight enveloped the dune landscape in a silken light, making the footprints and the ripples of sand stand out like pleated glass. But the hole, refusing a role in the scenery, was pitch black. It didn't particularly bother him. He was so exhausted that merely raising his head to look at the moon made him feel dizzy and nauseated. The woman was a black splotch against the black. She walked with him as he went toward the bed, but for some reason he could not see her at all. No, it was not the woman alone. Everything around him was blurred. Even after he had fallen onto the bed, in his mind he was still running with all his might over the sands. Even in his dream, he continued to run, but his sleep was light. The memory remained the distant barking of the dogs, and he could hear the coming and going of the baskets. He was aware that the woman had come back from her work once during the night for something to eat, and that she had lit the lamp beside his pillow to eat by. He awoke completely when he got up for a drink of water, but still he did not have enough energy to go and help her. Having nothing to do, he lit the lamp again, and absent-mindedly smoked a cigarette. A fat but agile spider began to circle around the lamp. It would be natural for a moth, but it was strange that the spider should be drawn by light. He was on the point of burning it with the cigarette, but he suddenly held back. It continued to circle around, quite precisely, within a radius of 7 to 10 inches, like the second hand of a watch. Or perhaps it was not a simple phototropic spider. He was watching it expectantly when a moth with dark gray wings, mottled with white and black crests, came fluttering along. Several times its enormous shadow was projected on the ceiling as it crashed against the lamp chimney. Then it perched on the metal handle motionless. It was a strange moth despite its vulgar appearance. He touched his cigarette to its body. Its nerve centers were destroyed, and he flicked the writhing insect into the path of the spider. At once the expected drama began. Instantly the spider leapt, fixing himself to the still living victim. Then it began to circle again, dragging its now motionless booty with it. It seemed to be smacking its lips in anticipation of the juicy meal. He had not known there were spiders like this. How clever to use the lamp in place of a web. In a web it could only wait passively, but with the lamp it could engage its prey. However, a suitable light was the prerequisite of the method. It was impossible to get such a light naturally. It would not do to look for a forest fire or wander about under the moon. Could this be a new species of spider, then, that had developed its instincts by evolving with man? It wasn't a bad hypothesis, but in that case, how could you explain the attraction of a moth for light? A moth is different from a spider, and lamplight can hardly be thought of as useful in maintaining the species. And yet the point was the same. Both phenomena had come about after man-made lights had come into being. The fact that moths did not at all go flying off to the moon was irrefutable proof of it. It would be understandable if this were the habit of only one species of moth, but since it was common to moths of about 10,000 varieties, he could only assume that it was an immutable law. This crazy, blind beating of wings caused by man-made light, this irrational connection between spiders, moths, and light. If a law appeared without reason like this, what could one believe in? He closed his eyes. Spots of light seemed to float before him. When he tried to catch them, they suddenly swirled rapidly and escaped him. They were like the shadows of beetles left on the sand. He was awakened by the woman sobbing. "What are you crying about?" The woman stood up hastily, trying to hide her embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I was just going to make you some tea." Her tearful voice puzzled him. Her back, as she bent over, stirring the fire in the hearth, made her seem strangely jittery, as it was time before he understood the meaning of it. He was slow, as if he were forcing his way through the musty pages of some book, yet he was able to turn the pages. Suddenly he seemed so miserable that he was sorry for himself. "I have failed. Yes, I have really failed. But there hasn't been a single person who made it. Not one." She spoke in an unsteady voice, but there was a certain strength in it, as if she were defending his failure. What pitiful tenderness! It would be too unfair if such tenderness were not rewarded. "Well, it's too bad. If I had been successful in escaping, I was thinking of sending you a radio." "A radio?" "I have been thinking about it for a long time." "Oh, no, you don't have to do that," the woman said, flustered as if she were making an excuse. "If I work hard at my side jobs, I'll be able to buy it myself. If I bought it in installments, the down payment would be enough." "Well, that's right. You could if you bought it in installments." "When the water's hot, shall I wash your back?" Suddenly, sorrow the color of dawn welled up in him. They might as well lick each other's wounds, but they would lick forever, and the wounds would never heal, and in the end their tongues would be worn away. I didn't understand, but life isn't something one can understand, I suppose. There are all kinds of life, and sometimes the other side of the hill looks greener. What's hardest for me is not knowing what living like this will ever come to. But obviously, you can never know, no matter what sort of life you live. Somehow I can't help but feel it would be better to have a little bit more to keep busy with. "Shall I wash you?" She spoke as if she were encouraging him. It was a soft, moving voice. He slowly began to unbutton his shirt and trousers. It was as if the sand had filled his whole skin. What was the other woman doing now, he wondered. What had happened before yesterday seemed like ages ago. The woman began to rub some soap on a wet cloth. October. During the day the traces of summer, reluctant to depart, still set the sand afire, and their bare feet could not stand it for more than 5 minutes at a time. But when the sun set, the crack-ridden walls of the room let in the cold light damp, and they had to get on with the work of drying out the wet ashes in the earth. Because of the change in the temperature on windless mornings and evenings, the mist rose like a muddy river. One day he tried setting a trap to catch crows in the empty space behind the house. He named it Hope. The device was exceptionally simple. It made use of the special properties of the sand. He dug a rather deep hole, and in the bottom he buried a wooden bucket. With 3 sticks the size of matches, he propped open a cover slightly smaller than the mouth of the bucket. To each stick he tied a thin thread. The threads ran through a hole in the middle of the lid and were connected to a wire on the outside. To the end of the wire he attached a piece of dried fish as bait, and the whole thing was carefully concealed with sand. From the outside, the only thing visible was the bait at the bottom of a sand bowl. As soon as a crow took the bait, the sticks would slip out, the lid would fall down, the sand would slide in, and the crow would be buried alive. He had made 2 or 3 trial runs. Everything worked perfectly. He could visualize the pitiful figure of the crow swallowed up by sliding sand without having had the time to even flap its wings. And then he would write a letter and fasten it to the crow's leg. Of course, it was all a question of luck. In the first place, the possibility was very slight that when he released the crow, it would fall into anyone's hands. He would never know where it would fly off to. Usually, the radius of a crow's flight was very limited. The worst risk was that the villagers would notice one crow in the flock with a piece of white paper attached to its legs and learn all about his plans. All his long-suffering patience would have been for naught. Since he had failed in his escape, he had become extremely cautious. He adjusted himself to the life of the hole as if it were a kind of hibernation, concentrating his efforts on making the villagers relax their vigilance. Repetition of the same patterns, they say, provides an effective form of protective coloring. If he were to melt into a life of simple repetition, there might possibly come a time when they could be quite unconscious of him. There was another effective element in repetition. For example, the woman had devoted herself for the last 2 months, day in and day out, to stringing beads, concentrating so fiercely that her face seemed bloated. Her long needle seemed to dance as she picked up, with its fine tip, the metallic beads scattered in the bottom of a cardboard box. He estimated her savings to be around 2,000 yen, enough to make a down payment on a radio in another 2 weeks. There was an importance about the dancing needle that made him feel it was the center of the world. Her repetitious movements gave color to the present and a feeling of actuality. The man, not to be outdone, decided to concentrate likewise on some especially monotonous handwork: sweeping sand from the ceiling, sifting rice, washing. Such work had already become his major daily operations. The time flew by, at least while he was at work. His invention of a small tent made of plastic to shelter them from the sand while they slept, and a device for steaming fish by burying it in hot sand. Such things made time pass rather pleasantly. Since he had come back, in order not to upset himself, he had really tried to get along without reading any newspapers. After a week he had no longer thought about reading. After a month, he almost forgot there were such things as newspapers. Once he had seen a reproduction of an engraving called Hell of Loneliness, and had thought it curious. In it a man was floating unsteadily in the air, his eyes wide with fright, and the space around him, far from being empty, was so filled with the semi-transparent shadows of dead persons that he could scarcely move. The dead, each with a different expression, were trying to push one another away, talking ceaselessly to the man. What was this hell of loneliness? He wondered. Perhaps they had misnamed it. He had thought then, but now he could understand it very well. Loneliness was an unsatisfied thirst for illusion. And so, one bit one's nails unable to find contentment in the simple beating of one's heart. One smoked unable to be satisfied with the rhythm of one's brain. One had the shakes, unable to find satisfaction in sex alone. Breathing, walking, bowel movements, daily schedules, Sundays coming every 7 days, final exams after every 4 months, far from quieting him. He had the effect, rather, of pushing him toward a new repetition of them. Soon his cigarette smoking had increased, and he had had terrible nightmares in which he was looking for hiding place away from the eyes of people with the woman who had dirty fingernails. And when finally he noticed that he was beginning to show toxic symptoms, he suddenly awoke to the heavens governed by an extremely simple elliptic cycle, and the sand dunes ruled by the 1/8 millimeter wavelengths. Even though he felt a certain contentment in the handwork which he performed daily and in repeated battle with the sand, his reaction was not quite masochistic. He would not find it strange if such a cure really existed. But one morning, along with the regular deliveries, he was presented with a cartoon magazine. The magazine was nothing in itself. The cover was worn and greasy with fingerprints. It must have been something they had gotten from a junkman. Yet, except for the fact that it was dirty, it was the kind of thoughtfulness that the villagers were likely to display. What puzzled him was that he had rolled over in laughter at it, beating the floor and writhing as if he were having convulsions. The cartoons were exceedingly stupid. They were meaningless, vulgar sketches that had been dashed off, and had he been asked, he would never have been able to explain why they were so amusing. One was so very funny, only because of the expression on the face of a horse that had fallen down, its legs broken under the weight of the big bruiser who had mounted it. How could he laugh so when he was in such a position? Shame on him! There was a limit to how far he should accommodate himself to his present plight. He had intended this accommodation to be a means, never a goal. It sounded all right to talk of hibernating, but had he changed into a mole and lost all desire to show his face in the sunlight again for the rest of his life? When he thought about it, he realized there was absolutely no way of knowing when and in what opportunity for escape would come. It was possible to conceive of simply becoming accustomed to waiting, with no particular goal in mind. And when his hibernation was at last over, he would be dazzled by the light, unable to come out. 3 days a beggar, always a beggar, they say. Such internal rot apparently comes on unexpectedly fast. He was thinking seriously about this, but the moment he recalled the expression on the horse's face, he was again seized with moronic laughter. In the lamplight, the woman, concentrating as usual on the fine work of stringing beads, raised her head and smiled back at him innocently. He could not bear his own deception, and, tossing the magazine away, he went out. A milky mist billowed and swirled above the cliff. Space of shadow speckled with the remains of night. Spaces that sparkled as if with glowing wire. Spaces floating with particular shining vapor. The combination of shadows was filled with fantasies and stirred limitless reveries in him. He would never tire of looking at the sight. Every moment overflowed with new discoveries. Everything was there. Actual shapes confounded with fantastic forms he had never seen before. He turned toward the swirling mass and appealed to it involuntarily. "Your Honor, I request to be told the substance of the prosecution. I request to be told the reason for my sentence. You see the defendant before you, awaiting your pleasure." Then a voice he remembered hearing before answered him from the mist. It sounded suddenly muffled, as if it were coming through a telephone. 1 out of every 100 after all. What did you say? I am telling you that in Japan, schizophrenia occurs at the rate of 1 out of every 100 persons. What in the name of... Kleptomania also seems to occur in about 1 out of every 100. What in the name of heaven are you talking about? If there is 1% of homosexuality among men, then naturally there must also be about 1% of lesbianism among women. Incendiaries account for 1%, those who tend to be vicious drinkers for 1%, mentally retarded 1%, sexual maniacs 1%, megalomaniacs 1%, habitual swindlers 1%, frigid women 1%, terrorists 1%, paranoiacs 1%. I wish you'd stop talking nonsense. Well, listen to me calmly. Acrophobes, heroin addicts, hysterics, homicidal maniacs, syphilics, morons. Suppose there were 1% of each of these. The total would be 20%. If you could enumerate 80 more abnormalities at this rate, and of course you could, there would be statistical proof that humanity is 100% abnormal. But nonsense! Abnormality would not come into being if there were no standard for normality. Come, come. I was just trying to defend you. Defend me? Even if you scarcely insist on your own guilt, I imagine. No, naturally. Then I wish you'd behave more obediently. No matter how exceptional your case is, there's absolutely no cause for worry. Just as people have no obligation to save a strange bird like you, they also don't have the right to judge you either. Strange bird? Why does resisting illegal detention make me a strange bird? Don't pretend you're so innocent. In Japan, a typical area of high humidity and heat, 87% of annual damage is by water. Damage by wind-blown sand, as in your case, would hardly come to 1,000 of 1%. Ridiculous. It would be like passing special laws against water damage in the Sahara Desert. I'm not talking about special laws. I'm talking about the suffering I went through. Illegal detention is illegal, whether it's in a desert or a bog. Oh, illegal detention. But there's no end to human greed, don't you see? You're a valuable possession for the villagers. Oh, balls. Even I have more reason for existence than that. You're quite sure it's all right to find fault with your beloved sand? Walt? I hear there are people in the world who, over a period of 10 years, have calculated the value of pi to several hundred decimal places. All right, I suppose they have that much reason for existence, but you took the trouble of coming to such a place at this precisely because you rejected such a reason for existence? No, that's not true. Even sand has a opposite face. You can use it to make casting molds, and it's also an indispensable material for setting concrete. Research is being done on improved farming by taking advantage of the fact that sand easily eliminates weeds and fungus growths. They have even experimented with changing sand into soil by using soil disintegrating enzymes. You can't talk about sand so sweepingly. Come, come now. What proselytism? If you change your point of view so much, I won't know what to believe, will I? I don't want to die like a beggar. Well, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, isn't it? The fish you don't catch is always the biggest. Damn it. Who are you? But the mist billowed in and erased the other voice. Instead, 100 sheaves of light, ruler straight, slid down. His head spun and he smothered a feeling of exhaustion which welled up in him like smoke. A crow cawed. Suddenly remembering the trap, he decided to go around in the back of the house and take a look at Hope. There was no likelihood of success, but it would be better than the cartoon magazine. The bait hung just as it was when he had set the trap. The stink of rotten fish struck his nose. It had been over 2 weeks since he had set Hope, and nothing whatever had happened. What could be the reason? He had confidence in the construction. If a crow would just take the bait, it would be nabbed. But he was completely helpless. since they paid no attention to it in the first place. But what could be so displeasing to them about hope? No matter from what angle he looked, he could find nothing suspicious about the trap. Crows were uncommonly cautious, because they scavenged for human refuse around where people lived. Well then, it was a question of who would have the most patience, until they became completely accustomed to the rotten fish in the hole. Patience itself was not necessarily defeat. Rather, defeat really began when patience was thought to be defeat. When he had named the contraption Hope, originally with this in mind, the Cape of Good Hope was not Gibraltar, but Cape Town. He returned slowly to the house, dragging his feet. It was time to sleep again. When the woman saw him, she blew out the lamp as if she had just remembered, and changed her position to a lighter place near the door. Did she still mean to go on working? He wondered. Suddenly, he felt an irresistible impulse. Standing in front of her, he struck the box of beads from her knees. Black grains, like grass seed, flew over the earthen floor, sinking all at once into the sand. She stared at him with a startled look, but said nothing. All expression suddenly left the man's face. A weak groan came from his sagging lips, followed by some yellowish spittle. It's pointless. You might as well give up. It's also pointless. The poison will soon be in your blood. She still said nothing. The beads which she had already strung swung feebly back and forth between her fingers, shining like drops of molasses. A slight shaking rose through her body. Yes, indeed, soon it'll be too late. We'll look one day and find that the villagers have disappeared to a man, and that we're the only ones left. I know it. It's true. This is going to happen soon for sure. It'll already be too late by the time we realize we've been betrayed. What we've done for them up till now will be just a joke to them. The woman's eyes were fixed on the beads which she held in her hands. She shook her head weakly. They couldn't do that. It's not anybody can make a living once he gets out of here. It all comes to the same thing then, doesn't it? Anyone who stays here is not living much of a life either. But there is the sand. The sand? The man clamped his teeth together, rolling his head. What good is sand? Outside of giving you a hard time, it doesn't bring in a penny. Yes, it does. They sell it. You sell it? Who do you sell such stuff to? Well, to construction companies and places like that. They mix it with concrete. Don't joke. It would be a fine mess if you mix this sand with cement. It's got too much salt in it. In the first place, it's probably against the law, or at least against construction regulations. Of course, they sell it secretly. They cut the hauling charges in half too. That's too absurd. Even if half price were free, that won't make it right when buildings and dams start to fall to pieces, will it? The woman suddenly interrupted him with accusing eyes. She spoke coldly, looking at his chest, and her attitude was completely different. Why should we worry what happens to others? He was stunned. The change was complete, as if a mask had dropped over her face. It seemed to be the face of the village, bared to him through her. Until then, the village was supposed to be on the side of the executioner. Or maybe they were mindless man-eating plants, or avaricious sea anemones. and he was supposed to be a pitiful victim who happened to be in their clutches. But from the standpoint of the villagers, they themselves were the ones who had been abandoned. Naturally, there was no reason why they should be under obligation to the outside world, so if it were he who caused injury, their fangs should accordingly be bared to him. It had never occurred to him to think of his relationship with the village in that light. It was natural that they should be confused and upset. But even if that were the case, and he conceded the point, it would be like throwing away his own justification. Well, maybe you don't have to worry about other people, he said, trying desperately to re-establish his position. But someone is ultimately getting a lot of money out of this sneaky business, isn't he? You don't have to lend your support to people like that. Oh, no. Buying and selling the sand is done by the union. I see. But even so, with the amount of investments or stock involved, anybody who was rich enough to have boats or anything got out of here a long time ago. You and I have been treated very well. Really, they weren't unfair to us. If you think I'm lying, get them to show you their records, and you'll see right away. The man stood rooted where he was in a vague confusion and malaise. For some reason he felt terribly downhearted. His military map, on which enemy and friendly forces were supposed to be clearly defined, was blurred with unknowns of intermediate colors like indeterminate blobs of ink. When he thought about it, he realized there was no need to get so upset over such an insignificant thing as a cartoon book. There was no one anywhere around who would have cared whether he laughed stupidly or not. His throat tightened, and he began to mutter disconnectedly. Well, yes, yes, of course, it's true about other people's business. Then words, which he did not expect, came by themselves to his lips. Let's buy a pot with the plant in it sometime, shall we? He was astonished himself, but the woman's expression was even more puzzled, and so he could not back down. It's so dreary not to have anything to rest your eyes on, she answered in an uneasy voice. Shall we have a pine? A pine? I don't like pines. Anything would be better than that. Even weeds. There's quite a bit of grass growing out toward the promontory. What do you call that? It's a kind of wheat or dune grass, I suppose. But a tree would be better, wouldn't it? If we get a tree, let's get a maple, or a paulownia, with thin branches and large leaves. Something with leaves that will flutter in the wind. Ones that flutter. Clusters of leaves, twisting and fluttering, trying in vain to escape from their branch. His breath, unrelated to his feeling, sounded a shallow. Somehow he felt he was about to break out in tears. Quickly he bent down where the beads had spilled on the earthen floor and began to feel all over the surface of the sand with an awkward, groping gesture. The woman stood up hastily. Let it go. I'll do it myself. It'll be easy if I use a sieve. One day, as he stood urinating and gazing at the grayish moon poised on the edge of the hole, as if it wanted to be held in his arms, he was suddenly seized with a terrible chill. Had he caught a cold? He wondered. No, this chill seemed to be a different kind. Many times he had experienced the sort of chill that comes just before a fever, but this was something else. He had no gooseflesh, no sense of the pricking of the air. It was the marrow of his bones rather than the surface of his skin that was trembling, and it was like ripples of water, spreading in slowly widening circles out from the center. A dull and ceaseless ache echoed from bone to bone. It was as if a rusty tin can, clattering along in the wind, had gone through his body. As he stood there, trembling, looking at the moon, a series of associated ideas occurred to him. The surface of the moon was like a grainy, powder-covered scar. Cheap, dried-out soap. A rusty aluminum lunchbox. Then, as it came into focus, it assumed an unexpected form. A white skull, the universal symbol for poison. White powder-covered tablets at the bottom of his insect bottle. An amazing resemblance between the texture of the moon's surface and that of the ever-fluorescent tablets of potassium cyanide. He wondered if the bottle were still hidden under the ledge that ran around the earthen floor, near the entrance where he had left it. His heart began to jump irregularly, like a broken ping-pong ball. Why did he have to think up such sinister things? A pretty sad association of ideas. And even if he hadn't, the October wind carried an oppressive echo of regret, its reedy voice sounding through empty, seedless husks. As he looked up at the rim of the hole, faintly limned in the moonlight, he mused that this searing feeling of his was perhaps jealousy. Maybe it was a jealousy of all things that presented a form outside the hole. Streets, trolley cars, traffic signals at intersections, advertisements on telephone poles, the corpse of a cat, the drugstore where they sold cigarettes, just as the sand nibbled away at the insides of the wooden walls and the uprights. So his jealousy was gnawing holes in him, making him like an empty pot on a stove. But the temperature of an empty pot rises quickly, and it might happen that soon, unable to stand the heat any longer, he would give up. First came the problem of weathering this moment before he could talk about hope. He wanted lighter air, at least fresh air, unmixed with his own breath. How wonderful it would be if, once a day, even for half an hour, he could climb up the cliff and look out over the sea. He should be allowed to do that much. Their check on him was too strict for him to escape. And then, too, it would seem to be a very reasonable request, considering the faithful work he had performed for them over more than 3 months. Even a prisoner in confinement had the right to a period of exercise. I really can't stand it. If I keep on like this, sticking my nose in the sand every day in the year, I'll turn into a human pickle. I wonder if I could get them to let me walk around once in a while. The woman kept her mouth closed as if annoyed. She looked like someone who does not know what to do with the peevish child who has lost his candy. I won't let them say I can't. Suddenly, the man became angry. He even mentioned the rope ladder, so hard for him to talk about because of the loathsome memories. The other day, when I was running away, I saw it with my own eyes. Some houses in this row actually had rope ladders hanging down to them. Yes, but, she said timidly, as if apologizing, most of those people have been living there for generations. Well, do you mean there's no hope for us? The woman bent her head with resignation, like a dejected dog. Even if he swallowed the potassium cyanide before her very eyes, she would probably let him go through with it without saying a word. All right, I'll try to negotiate directly with them. However, in his heart, he did not expect that such negotiations would be successful. He was quite used to being disappointed, and so when the old man at once brought back an answer with the second gang of basket hoisters, he was surprised and bewildered. But his surprise was unimportant compared with the contents of the answer. "Well, let's see," the old man said slowly and falteringly, speaking as if he were arranging old papers on his head. "It's, not, absolutely impossible to arrange. Well, this is just an example, but if the two of you came out front, with all of us watching you, and if you'd go to it and let us see, well, what you want is reasonable enough, so we've all decided, that it's all right." "What do you mean that you see?" "Well, the two of you doing it together. That's what we mean." Around him, the gang of basket carriers suddenly broke out in mad laughing. The man stood numbly, as if someone were strangling him, but slowly he began to understand exactly what they meant, and he began to understand that he understood. Once he had comprehended their proposal, didn't seem particularly surprising. The beam of a flashlight skimmed by his feet like some golden bird, as if it were a sign. 7 or 8 more shafts fused into a dish of light and began to creep around the bottom of the hole. Overpowered by the burning resin ardor of the men at the top of the cliff, he was almost caught up in their madness before he could resist. Slowly, he turned toward the woman. She had been wielding her shovel there until a moment ago, and now she had vanished. Had she fled into the house? He looked in at the door and called to her. "What shall we do?" The woman's muffled voice came directly from behind the wall. "Let them be." "But I want to get out. I really do." "But how can you? You mustn't take it so seriously. Have you gone out of your mind?" The woman suddenly gasped. "You must have. You've left your senses. I couldn't do a thing like that. I'm not sex mad." Was it really true? He wondered. Had he gone out of his mind? He winced from the woman's vehemence, but inside him spread a kind of perverse blankness. He had been trampled this much, but what difference could appearances make now? If there was something wrong from the standpoint of one who was being watched, then there was just as much wrong from that of the ones who were watching. There was no need to distinguish between watcher and watched. There might still be some difference between them, but this little ceremony would be enough to make it vanish. And just think what he could get as a prize. Ground on which he could walk where he wished. He wanted to take a deep breath with his face above the surface of this stagnant water. Sensing where the woman was, he suddenly threw his whole body upon her. Her cries and the sound of the two of them, entangled, falling against the sand wall, roused an animal-like excitement and frenzy at the top of the cliff. Whistling, clapping, obscene, wordless screams. The number of watchers had grown and now included some young woman among the men, and the number of flashlights whose light flooded over the doorway had increased at least 3 times. He had been successful, perhaps because he had taken her by surprise. Somehow he was able to drag her outside, holding her by the collar. She was a dead, bag-light weight. The lights, in a tight semicircle around 3 sides of the hole, were like the bonfires of some nocturnal festival. Although it was not really that hot, perspiration, like a layer of flayed skin, poured from his armpits, and his hair was soaked, as if he had poured water over it. The cries of the onlookers were like compressed reverberations, filling the sky over his head with great black wings. He felt as if the wings were his own. He could feel the breathless villagers looking down from the top of the cliff. So clearly they could have been himself. They were a part of him. Their viscid, drooling saliva was his own desire. In his mind, he was the executioner's representative rather than the victim. The string of her trousers was unexpectedly troublesome. It was dark, and his trembling fingers seemed twice as clumsy as usual. When at last he had torn them off, he grabbed her buttocks in two hands and shifted his hips under her. But at that instant she twisted her body and wrenched away. He churned through the sand as he tried to catch her, but again he was pushed back with a steel-like resistance. He grabbed her violently, entreating, "Please, please, I can't really do it anyway, just pretend." However, there was no need to grasp at her any longer. She had already lost all desire to escape. He heard a noise of cloth tearing, and at the same instant he was struck a terrible blow in the belly by the point of her shoulder, which bore the weight and anger of her whole body. He simply grasped his knees and bent in two. The woman, leaning over him, struck his face again and again with their fists. At first her movements seemed slow, but each blow delivered as though they were pounding salt carried weight. Blood gushed from his nose. Sand clung to the blood. His face was a lump of earth. The excitement at the top of the cliff rapidly folded like an umbrella with broken ribs. Although they tried to join, their voices of discontent and laughter and urging onto one, they were already out of step and ragged. There, the obscene and drunken boos and hisses did nothing to arouse enthusiasm. Someone threw something, but he was at once reproved by someone else. The end was as abrupt as the beginning. Cries urging the men back to work trailed in the distance, and the line of lights disappeared as if they had been drawn in. All that remained was the dark north wind, blowing away the last traces of excitement. But the man, beaten and covered with sand, vaguely thought that everything, after all, had gone as it was written it should. The idea was in a corner of his consciousness like a sodden undergarment, where only the beating of his heart was painfully clear. The woman's arms, hot as fire, were under his armpits, and the odor of her body was a thorn piercing his nose. He abandoned himself to her hands as if he were a smooth, flat stone in a river bed. It seemed that what remained of him had turned into a liquid and melted in her body. Monotonous weeks of sand and night had gone by. Hope, as before, lay neglected by the crows, and the bait of dried fish had become not even that. Although spurned by the crows, it had not been spurned by the bacteria. One morning, when he felt the end of the stick, he found that only the skin remained. The fish had turned into a black, almost liquid pulp. As he was changing the bait, he decided at the time to check on the contraption. He scraped away the sand and opened the cover. He was thunderstruck. Water had collected at the bottom of the bucket. There were only about 4 inches, but it was more clear by far. Indeed, it was almost pure than the water with the metallic film which was delivered to them daily. Had it rained some time recently? He wondered. No, not for half a month at least. If that were true, then could it be the rain that was left from half a month ago? He would like to think so. But what puzzled him was that he knew the bucket leaked, and when he raised it up, as he had expected, water at once began to fall from the bottom. At that depth there could be no underground spring, and he was obliged to recognize that the escaping water was being constantly replenished from somewhere. At least, that must be theoretically so, but wherever could the replenishment come from in the midst of this parched sand? He could scarcely obtain his gradually rising excitement. There was only one answer he could think of. That was the capillary action of the sand, because the surface sand had high specific heat. It was invariably dry, but when you dug down a little, the under part was always damp. It must be that the surface evaporation acted as a kind of pump, drawing up the subsurface water. When he thought about it, everything was easily explained. The enormous quantity of mist that came out from the dunes every morning and evening, the abnormal moisture which clung to the pillars and walls, rotting the wood. In short, the dryness of the sand was not due simply to a lack of water, but rather, it would seem, to the fact that the suction caused by capillary attraction never matched the speed of evaporation. In other words, the water was being constantly replenished, but this water circulated at a speed unthinkable in ordinary soil, and it had happened that hope had cut off the circulation some place. Probably the chance placing of the bucket and the crack around the lid had been enough to prevent evaporation of the water that had been sucked up in the bucket. He could not yet explain exactly the placing and its relationship to the other elements, but with study he would surely be able to repeat the experiment. Moreover, it should not be impossible to construct a more efficient device for storing the water. If he were successful in this experiment, he would no longer have to give in to the villagers if they cut off his water. But more important, he had found the sand was an immense pump. It was just as if he were sitting on a suction pump. He had to sit down for a moment and control his breathing in order to quiet the wild beating of his heart. Of course, there was no need yet to tell anyone about this. It would be his trump card in case of emergency. But he could not suppress the natural laughter that welled up in him, even if he were able to keep silent about hope. It was hard to conceal the elation in his heart. He suddenly let out a cry and put his arms around the woman's hips from behind as she was getting the bed ready. And when she dodged away, he fell over on his back and lay kicking his legs and laughing all the while. It was as if his stomach were being tickled by a paper balloon filled with some special light gas. He felt that the hand he held to his face was floating free in the air. The woman laughed reluctantly, but it was probably only to be agreeable. He was thinking of the vast network of water veins creeping up through the sand, but the woman, on the contrary, was surely thinking that his actions were sexual advances. That was all right. Only a shipwrecked person who just escaped drowning could understand the psychology of someone who breaks out in laughter just because he is able to breathe. The fact that he was still just as much as the bottom of the hole as ever had not changed, but he felt quite as if he had climbed to the top of a high tower. Perhaps the world had been turned upside down, and his projections and depressions reversed. Anyway, he had discovered water in this sand. As long as he had his device, the villagers would not be able to interfere with him so easily. No matter how much they cut off his supply, he would be able to get along very well. Again, laughter welled up in him at the very thought of the outcry the villagers would make. He was still in the hole, but it seemed as if he were already outside. Turning around, he could see the whole scene. You can't really judge a mosaic if you don't look at it from a distance. If you really get close to it, you get lost in detail. You get away from one detail only to get caught up in another. Perhaps what he had been seeing up until now was not the sand, but grains of sand. He could say precisely the same thing about the other woman and his former fellow teachers.